how can you prepare for, and why should you prepare for an economic disaster? We were hoping we were just coming out of all this, Kevin.
Well, unfortunately, the people that helped us go into it are still at work. Bottom line is that most of the world looks at America and says militarily we can't match them. But in 1999, two colonels from China's military, People's Liberation Army, did a study and wrote a book titled Unrestricted Warfare, and they said the way to beat America is to hurt our economy. And if you hurt our economy, then we'll crumble. And in fact, that's what we've seen, all this massive change internally in the United States ever since the economic crisis of 2008.
And so where are we the most vulnerable? If you had to make a prediction as to what could really happen and in real terms what that would look like, tell us about that.
The most vulnerable, but not the most likely necessarily, is to an electromagnetic pulse attack.
Okay.
Where North Korea or someone else could wipe out our electric grid.
And so let's say that happens, because I'm hearing more and more about that in the media, and I'm hearing even more. I think the Heritage Foundation is doing quite a lot of research talking about this and saying it might not be as far-fetched as we'd like to think it is. And I've even heard the word said, it's not a matter of if, but when regarding this electromagnetic pulse. Tell us what you know about that.
What I know is that our electric grid is incredibly vulnerable to an outage. And an outage, an EMP attack, whether it's natural or man-made, is inevitable. That's Lloyd's of London did a study and said that every 100 to 300 years we have what's known as a Carrington event. This last one happened in the 1850s. It would have wiped out our power grid, but we didn't have that back in the 1850s. But it wiped out the Western Union telegraph lines. It is where a coronal mass ejection from the sun goes out and travels to the Earth. We had one happen last week, but it hits in such a way that it blows all the transformers. Now, if North Korea wanted to sit in the Gulf of Mexico and launch a missile from a barge and explode a thermonuclear device over the continental United States, that would have that same impact only multiplied by a certain degree. So it is where we're vulnerable. The government, unfortunately, has done very little to address it. It's one of the things I talk about in my book, Game Plan, and it's one type of economic warfare.
All right, so let's move from the potentiality of all of this to the practicality, and tell us, how can we possibly prepare for something like this? At least with tornadoes and earthquakes and things like that, somewhere someone has experienced that, floods, all the rest of it. We have no clue how to prepare for this because we've never really had anything happen like this on a mass scale. What do you tell people? What's the most surprising thing that probably would take place in a disaster like that?
Well, because we have a just-in-time delivery system for our economy, the most surprising thing is the shelves will be bare within minutes, and there will be no access to food, water, medicine, and so forth. Now, the good news is that there is a group headed by Newt Gingrich and Jim Woolsey, former director of Central Intelligence, and I work with them and I sit on their calls occasionally. Very smart people, and they're actively working with the states and the federal government to address it. The bad news is that there's nothing really in place to prevent it now. The book Game Plan that I wrote just lists this as one of maybe 10 different economic warfare attacks, and each one of them requires a different response. In the case of outing of the power grid, the response is to have access to food and water. It's a mini prepper show, but it's also at the state and federal level, there are certain things we can do by having transformers in place or shielding equipment and so forth. So my book was written to list all the different types of economic warfare, and then what is the strategy if there's a cyber attack on the stock market, which is very likely. It's happened a couple of times in the past few years. If they wiped out the stock exchange, what should you do? One practical thing, you should have stock certificates issued out to you, or you should at least have very good records of what you own. So
paper
we go
copies.
through and talk about each of those.
Yeah, and you're talking about paper copies in that specific example, someplace in some sort of vault that you can get to them. Is that what you mean by that?
That's exactly right. A lot of people get their statements electronically, but if your computer gets wiped out, how will you prove that you own what you own?
what's going to be what would be the most what form of money should people have in this particular situation? Is it the, grandma, back to grandma, keeping the few $100s, few $1,000s underneath the mattress, or are people going to be trading other things? Tell us a little bit about the money system and how that would change.
We actually have a chapter titled "Why Money in the Mattress is a Bad Idea."
No.
And we walk through. I mean, there was a toddler in China that ripped up her parents' life savings in 30,000 yuan, tore it up because it was paper and accessible. People have thrown out mattresses with money. Keeping money, paper money, will be helpful if we encounter one attack, which is a deflationary attack. Then it will be beneficial, and it would be helpful if the ATM system went down or something like that. But it's a terrible idea if we go into an inflation or a currency attack, and that is something that China, Russia, and others are planning at some point to devalue the dollar and remove it as reserve currency of the world.
So if not paper money, then what is it, gold or silver?
It's all, you have to have a diversified portfolio, and you have to be watching the signs as they happen to determine what's the best thing to have. So, I would recommend everyone have a certain amount of paper money that they keep, but also have some gold and silver in various forms and some stock holdings. The stock market actually does quite well under certain of these attack scenarios, one of which is a currency collapse.
In times like that, though, wouldn't things like food, perhaps even ammunition, be good to stockpile to some degree? I mean, talk to the practical planner here, not the person who is going to save the world and be able to put in new security systems so that these things don't happen. But talk to me just for the average, let's say, single mother of 2 kids. What would you tell her? This is in your must-have box in your 800 square foot apartment in San Francisco, California. What do you say to her?
Well, you'd have a couple of weeks of food and water, and I actually address this in the book. I have a complete checklist of what you want to have. One way to do that is you can buy a bathtub liner. It's actually a big bladder that goes in your bathtub, and if you knew the water was going out, which happened to my sister over the holidays because her hot water broke.
Oh.
Hot water heater broke. But you could fill up that bladder, which would hold 100 gallons of water, and that's useful. You need about 2 gallons per person per day minimum in water. So you could have that. You can have these life straws where you can filter the water on the go. You need to have non-perishable foods, and I don't mean that you have to fill out your 800 square foot apartment with boxes of Cheerios, but you ought to have at least a couple of weeks' supply at a minimum, and that's affordable for most people, and it makes sense, and it's just simple, good precaution.
All right, well, those are some good suggestions. What about ammo? That seems to be the popular thing to stockpile these days. It's getting more and more expensive. Is that something people should have a lot of?
Well, if that is something that if you own a gun, and you should have a decent supply of ammo, and realize that that's also something you can barter with.
Yeah, becomes currency.
Coffee works too.
Coffee. Well, that doesn't surprise me somehow. I think people might want to stockpile some coffee. It would definitely come in handy. I remember back during the tornado that I was talking about that I encountered when I first got to Alabama, things like coffee and cigarettes became a form of currency, even just in neighborhoods where people were just trying to deal with the stress of getting through the day and all of the work. And so even in just natural disasters like that, for those first few days until FEMA and the Red Cross get there, you do need those things. But the rest of the more comprehensive list is, of course, in your book, Game Plan. Kevin, tell us where we can get a copy of your book for more information about what we should be doing.
It's at Barnes & Noble, it's at Amazon, but you can go to secretweapon.org. That's my website. And there are links there where you can see interviews, you can read blog posts, you can see different people like Lieutenant General Boykin and others who've commented on my book, the head of the American Bankers Association, and so forth. The point is no one's saying that any one of these disasters is going to happen, but here are practical steps you can take to protect yourself in case of a stock market crash, in case of currency problems, in case of a natural disaster, and so forth. It's just a simple read, and you should know the enemies of the United States have planned to take us down. Whether they'll be successful or not, I can't tell you, but they have plans, and this lists the plans.
Well, and you know what, Kevin, the reality is that even if that doesn't happen, natural disasters do. I so appreciate your book. It's called Game Plan. Get your copy. Up next, we're going to take a look at some prepper products. What are the must-haves when it comes to prepping? Well, that's coming up next on Smart Life. Stay tuned.